For almost 300 years, the most trusted object in the Western world was a small silver coin, about the size of a modern fingernail. It was called the denarius. A soldier on the frozen northern wall of Britain was paid in it. A grain merchant in the deserts east of the Euphrates would take it without blinking. It bought bread in Carthage and rent in Rome and wine in Gaul, and nobody who handled it stopped to wonder whether it was real, because for 3 centuries it always was. Under the Emperor Augustus, that coin was about 98% pure silver. You could bite it, weigh it, melt it. It was worth exactly what it said it was worth. That is not a small thing. That is the quiet miracle that an empire runs on. A coin that everyone trusts is a promise that everyone keeps without thinking about it. And that shared, invisible promise is what lets a farmer in Egypt and a legion in Germany act as if they belong to the same world. Now here is the same coin, more or less, in the year 268. By then the silver was gone. Not reduced. Gone. The coin the state was handing its soldiers was a lump of copper dipped in a thin silver wash that wore off in your palm after a few weeks in a purse. About 2% silver, and often less. And the empire minting that fraud was, at that exact moment, closer to disappearing from the map than it had been in 500 years. Emperors were being murdered at a rate of roughly 1 every 2 years. The provinces were breaking away. A plague was emptying the cities. You were probably taught why. You were taught that Rome fell to the barbarians, the Goths and the Vandals and the Huns pouring across the rivers, and you were taught that Rome fell to itself, to luxury and decadence, and a loss of the old hard virtues, the version the historian Edward Gibbon made famous in the 18th century, where a civilization grows fat and soft and Christian, and simply stops fighting for itself. Both of those stories contain real things. Barbarians did come, the empire did change, but the version that gets told in classrooms and in most documentaries skips the chapter that serious historians keep circling back to. It is not a chapter about swords or morals. It is a chapter written in coins, in grain prices, in tax ledgers, and it says something uncomfortable. Long before any barbarian king sat on a Roman throne, Rome had already quietly broken the one promise holding the whole thing together. It had defaulted on its own money. And the way it clawed its way back from that default is, strangely, a much better explanation for why the West eventually died than any invasion. To see how, you have to start with the coin, and with a simple, dangerous idea that has tempted almost every government since. The idea begins with a problem every emperor had, the army. Rome was, above everything else, a military machine, and that machine ran on cash. Hundreds of thousands of professional soldiers had to be paid, in coin, on time, or they stopped being your soldiers and started shopping for a new emperor who would pay them better. This was not a minor budget line. In good years, the army swallowed the majority of everything the state collected. And an emperor's problem was this: the amount of silver in the world did not grow on command. The mines produced what they produced. Taxes could only be squeezed so far before people revolted. So what do you do when the bills are due, the mines are flat, and the soldiers are waiting? And it was getting harder, not easier. The great silver mines of Spain that had helped build the empire were being worked out, their richest veins exhausted. At the same time, Roman silver was leaking steadily out of the empire altogether, flowing east to pay for the luxuries the wealthy could not live without. Silk from China, pepper and spices from India, incense from Arabia, these were paid for in hard coin, and that coin did not come back. The writer Pliny the Elder, back in the 1st century, had already grumbled that India, China, and Arabia between them drained the empire of 100 million sesterces a year, vanishing into the east in exchange for things that were, in his sour phrase, worn out or eaten within the year. So the emperor was caught in a vice. The bills went up as the wars dragged on. The supply of new silver went down as the mines failed and the coin drained away. Something had to give. There is a trick. It is almost invisible, and that is what makes it so seductive. You call in 1 million old coins in taxes. You melt them down, you mix in a little cheap copper, restrike the metal, and now you have 1 million and a bit coins where you had 1 million before. You spend the extra. Nobody in the marketplace notices, because the new coin looks exactly like the old one, and carries the same name. That trick has a name too: debasement. It is, in plain terms, a hidden tax. The government quietly takes a sliver of the value out of every coin already in people's hands, and it does it without a vote, without an announcement, without anyone feeling the pickpocket's fingers. The first emperor to reach for that trick in a serious way was Nero, in the year 64. He shaved the denarius from roughly 98% silver down to about 90 and trimmed its weight a little too. To an ordinary Roman, nothing changed. The coin looked the same, it spent the same, but the money changers who ran thousands of coins through their fingers every day knew, and something small and important began to erode. Here is a detail worth holding on to. Roman coins were also the empire's newspaper. The emperor's face wrote on every one of them, into every hand, to every frontier. Nero, who cared a great deal about his own face, understood the coin as propaganda. He may not have understood that he had just taught every emperor after him how to steal quietly from the future. For a long time the theft stayed gentle. Under Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher on the throne, fighting plague and German wars, the denarius slipped to around 75% silver. His son's generation pushed it lower. Then Septimius Severus, a hard soldier who seized power in a civil war, took it down to roughly half silver and gave his sons a piece of deathbed advice that tells you exactly where the empire's priorities sat. Enrich the soldiers, he said, and despise everyone else. His son Caracalla found a new way to do it. In the year 215, he introduced a shiny new coin, later called the Antoninianus, and declared it worth 2 denarii. It was not worth 2 denarii. It carried only about 1.5 denarii of silver, so every time the state paid you in the new coin, it was skimming a quarter of the value off the top and calling it progress. The numismatist Kenneth Harl put the paradox at the heart of all this neatly. The whole scheme only worked because Romans still trusted their coins. That inherited trust, built up over centuries, was the reserve the emperors were secretly spending. And a reserve of trust, unlike a mine, cannot be reopened once it runs dry. Ordinary people were not stupid. They could feel the ground shifting under them even when they could not name it, and they did the thing people always do when they suspect the money is going bad. They kept the good coins and spent the bad ones. If an old, heavy, high silver denarius came into your hands, you did not take it to market. You buried it. You put it in a pot under the floor of your house or in a field wall, saving the real silver and passing along the junk, and you told no one where it was. We know they did this because the evidence is still coming out of the ground. Across the empire, the number of buried coin hoards that were never dug back up spikes sharply in the middle of the 3rd century, exactly when the money was dying. Each one of those hoards is, in a way, a small tragedy frozen in clay. Someone hid their savings, meaning to come back for them. And then, often enough, they didn't, because the century that was killing the coinage was killing people too. For about 200 years they got away with it, because the theft was slow and prices were mostly calm. Then, in the middle of the 3rd century, the slow theft turned into a landslide. This is the part where the trap springs shut, and it springs shut because of a loop. When people finally stop trusting a coin, they demand more of them for the same loaf of bread. Prices rise. But rising prices eat the value of the coin the government still needs to pay its soldiers. So the government debases even harder to make up the shortfall, which makes people trust the coin even less, which pushes prices higher still. Round and round. Each turn of the wheel is a rational decision by a desperate man, and each turn makes the next turn worse. By the 260s, the Antoninianus had collapsed to that 2 to 5% silver wash. And the price data we have, mostly from the dry sands of Egypt where papyrus survives, shows exactly what you would expect. A measure of wheat that sold for around 8 drachmas in the early empire, and roughly 17 through the troubled 2nd century, had climbed to around 200 drachmas by the 270s. The economist Peter Temin and papyrologists like Roger Bagnall and Dominic Rathbone have reconstructed these numbers from surviving receipts and account books, and the curve does not bend, it breaks. Now watch what the broken money did to Roman politics, because this is where the money story and the blood story become the same story. The coin paid the army made emperors. So when the coin failed, the emperors began to fail with it, one after another, faster and faster. Between the years 235 and 284, a stretch of 49 years, roughly 26 men were recognized as emperor, and that is only counting the ones the Senate acknowledged. There were more. The average reign was about 2 years. Most of them were killed, very often by their own soldiers, who had learned that the fastest route to a pay raise was to murder the man currently signing the checks and sell the throne to the next bidder. In a single year, 238, 6 different men held the title. The empire came apart at the seams, a breakaway Gallic empire in the west, under a general named Postumus, and in the east, a breakaway realm ruled from the desert city of Palmyra by a queen named Zenobia, and here is the cruel machinery of it. Every new emperor, hauled up by the troops, had to pay those troops a bonus for the honor of being murdered later. Where did the bonus come from? The mint, more debased coins, handed out to buy a loyalty that lasted exactly until a rival offered more. The cure for each crisis guaranteed the next one. Nobody in that room could stop, because the first man to pay his soldiers in honest, scarce silver would simply be killed by soldiers who preferred the emperor across the river with the bottomless bag of shiny fakes. The disasters did not queue up politely. They arrived all at once. From around the year 249, a devastating epidemic, now called the Plague of Cyprian, tore through the empire, named for the bishop who described the dying. In Alexandria, the second city of the Roman world, some accounts suggest the population may have fallen by well over half. A plague does not only kill people, it kills taxpayers and it kills soldiers, and it does both at the exact moment an empire fighting for its life can least afford to lose either. And then, in the year 260, came a humiliation without precedent in Roman history. The Emperor Valerian marched east to fight the resurgent Persian Empire, and he lost. He was captured alive on the battlefield, the only Roman emperor ever taken prisoner by a foreign enemy. According to the Roman sources, the Persian king Shapur kept him as a living trophy and used the old emperor's stooped back as a step to mount his horse. We should be a little careful with that image, because it comes down to us through hostile writers who had every reason to make it vivid. But even stripped of the propaganda, the bare fact was enough to shake the ancient world. The master of the civilized earth had been caught like a runaway slave, and he would die in captivity. If the coin was a promise, this was the year the promise stopped being believed abroad as well as at home. While the men at the top were dying, the collapse was quietly destroying the people who actually held the empire together in the middle. Consider the decurions. These were the local notables, the town councilors, the men who ran the cities of the empire, and crucially, who were personally responsible for delivering their town's tax quota to Rome. In the good centuries, this was a position of pride. Men paid bribes to get onto the council. But as the money melted, the state kept demanding the same value in taxes from coins that were worth less every year, and it increasingly demanded to be paid not in cash but in goods it could actually use. If a decurion could not squeeze the full amount out of his neighbors, the shortfall came out of his own estate. Within a couple of generations, the honor became a trap. Men who had once bribed their way onto the council now bribed their way off it, or simply ran, abandoning their property to escape a job that could ruin them. The empire was eating the class that administered it, and the people below them were running too. When the tax burden on a small farm grew heavier than the farm could bear, families walked away from land their ancestors had worked for centuries. Some drifted into the shadow of a big local landowner and traded their freedom for protection, becoming tenants on estates they had once owned outright. Others went further. In the countryside of Gaul and Spain, bands of dispossessed peasants and deserters formed armed groups the Romans called the Bagaudae, who raided, robbed, and at times set up their own rough authority in the gaps where the state had stopped functioning. Rome had spent 3 centuries teaching the provinces that being Roman meant safety and order. Now, in whole districts, being Roman mostly meant being taxed by a government that could no longer protect you, and people were quietly opting out. So the money was worthless, the emperors were disposable, and the cities were hollowing out. By any reasonable measure, Rome should have ended right there in the 260s, in a heap of copper slugs and dead usurpers. It did not. And how it saved itself is the real heart of this story, because the rescue is what did the lasting damage. The recovery came from a run of tough, unglamorous soldier emperors from the Balkans who clawed the pieces back together by force. One of them, Aurelian, reunited the empire and tried, around the year 274, to reform the coinage and put honest metal back into the currency. The attempt was so disruptive that it helped trigger a revolt, and at one point the workers of the Roman mint themselves rose up in a bloody uprising. Fixing the money, it turned out, was almost as dangerous as breaking it. Then, in 284, came the man who actually stopped the bleeding, Diocletian. He is the hinge this whole story turns on, and he is a genuinely strange figure to judge, because everything he did to save Rome is also what made Rome brittle. Diocletian ended the revolving door emperors by splitting the throne deliberately, sharing power among 4 rulers so that no single murder could topple everything. He rebuilt the army and the provinces, and he tried to fix the money. He minted new, better coins with real silver and gold in them. But decades of ruined trust do not come back because one strong emperor asks nicely, and prices kept climbing anyway. So in the year 301, Diocletian did something that governments in trouble have been trying ever since, always with the same result. He issued the edict on maximum prices. It was an astonishing document, and what survives of it on stone fragments across the empire is almost hypnotic to read, because it tried to fix a price on the entire economy. It capped the daily wage of a farm laborer and the daily wage of a skilled carpenter. It set the fee a teacher could charge per pupil and the fee a lawyer could charge to plead a case. It priced meat by the animal, wine by the region, and even reached out to cap the cost of the most extravagant luxuries the rich indulged in, the imported silks and dyes and beasts. Over 1,000 entries. And the penalty for selling above any of these ceilings was not a fine or a flogging. It was death. Diocletian, in the edict's own preamble, framed the whole thing as a moral crusade, blaming the crisis on the boundless greed of speculators and profiteers who preyed on soldiers and the poor, and he set out to break them with the executioner. It failed almost immediately, and it failed in a way that teaches you something permanent about money. A contemporary writer named Lactantius, admittedly no friend of Diocletian, described the result. Blood was shed over small and cheap things, and then, out of fear, goods simply vanished from the market altogether. Of course they did. If the law says you must sell your grain for less than it cost you to grow it, and selling it at a fair price gets you killed, you do not sell your grain. You hide it. The shelves empty. A black market blooms in the shadows. The price edict was an attempt to command the fever to go down without touching the infection, and you cannot legislate value back into a coin that no longer has any. Within a few years it was a dead letter. But Diocletian's deeper response to worthless money is the one that reshaped the Western world, and almost nobody outside a lecture hall has heard of it. If your money is unreliable, and you are a state that must feed and clothe and arm an enormous army, you stop trusting money, you go around it. Diocletian overhauled the tax system so that the empire increasingly collected what it needed directly, in kind: grain, oil, wine, cloth, bodies for the army. He ordered a vast census of land and people, assessing taxes on units of farmland and units of labor, so the state could reach past the broken coin and grab the real stuff off the farm. And to make absolutely certain the grain and the recruits kept coming, the late empire began locking people in place. Farmers, the coloni, were bound by law to the land they worked, forbidden to leave, their status inherited by their children. Sons were required to follow their fathers into essential trades. The baker's son would bake, the soldier's son would soldier. Rome, unable to rely on the free promise of money, rebuilt itself on compulsion. To run this new system, the state itself had to swell. Diocletian roughly doubled the number of provinces, slicing the empire into smaller and smaller administrative pieces so the tax collectors could reach into every corner, and he stacked new layers of officials above them to watch the watchers. The army grew. The bureaucracy grew faster. Lactantius, our hostile witness, complained that the number of men living off the taxes had begun to outstrip the number of men actually paying them, and while he was exaggerating to make a point, the point was real. A state that cannot trust its money has to replace trust with paperwork and enforcement are expensive. The machine that collected the taxes was itself becoming one of the largest things the taxes had to feed. That is the empire that stumbles into the 4th century, stabilized, saved, genuinely saved, from the abyss of the 260s, but transformed into something heavier and harder, and far more resented, than the empire that went into the crisis. The old Rome had governed with a surprisingly light touch, a thin layer of administration floating on top of self-governing cities that mostly ran themselves. The new Rome sat on its people with its full weight, counting them, binding them, taxing them in grain and labor, and watching them to make sure they did not slip away. It was a fortress, and a fortress is a wonderful thing to have until the day you realize you are the one locked inside it. And then Constantine added the final fateful piece. Around the year 309, the Emperor Constantine introduced a new gold coin, the solidus, struck at 72 to a Roman pound. And this coin was honest. It held its weight and its purity so reliably that it became the anchor of the economy for the next 700 years, outliving the Western Empire entirely and circulating for centuries as the money of Byzantium. On its face, this is the happy ending. Rome finally got its trustworthy coin back. Look closer, and it is not an ending at all. It is the moment Rome split into two, because the beautiful gold solidus mostly served the people who already had gold. The state collected in it. The great landowners hoarded it. The top of the army got it. But the ordinary Roman, the laborer and the shopkeeper and the tenant farmer still lived and worked in the world of the small copper coinage, and that coinage kept right on inflating. Remember the wheat, around 200 drachmas in the 270s. By the year 324, roughly 78,000. 10 years after that, in 334, more than 2 million. The gold froze solid at the top, while the copper evaporated at the bottom, and the widening gap between those two worlds became the actual shape of late Roman society, a small class living on hard, stable wealth, and a vast population living on money that dissolved in their hands, and taxes that no longer even bothered to be money. Here is the human detail that stays with me. A priest in 5th century Gaul, named Salvian, wrote that some Romans were fleeing across the frontier to live under the barbarians, and he explained why without flinching. Under the barbarians, he said, they could at least be themselves. Under Rome, they were ground down by the tax collector. When your own citizens start preferring the invaders because the invaders tax them less, the empire has already lost the argument for its own existence, long before it loses a battle. So let me put the reframe as plainly as I can, because this is the thing the textbook version leaves out. Rome did not fall because its coin became worthless. Rome survived its coin becoming worthless. It clawed back from the worst monetary collapse in ancient history and stood for another 2 centuries in the West. What Rome could not survive was what it did to survive. To keep the soldiers paid after the money failed, Rome remade itself into a machine for extraction. More tax, more bureaucracy, labor chained to the land, a currency that worked for the powerful and betrayed everyone else. That machine was strong enough to hold the frontier through the 4th century. It was too rigid, too heavy, and too hated to survive a real shock in the 5th, and when the shock came, it came exactly where the machine was weakest. The archaeologist Brian Ward-Perkins, one of the historians who takes the economics of this seriously, lays out the death spiral with brutal clarity. Rome's security depended on a paid professional army. That army depended on tax revenue. Tax revenue depended on a settled, prosperous countryside actually generating a surplus. So when barbarian groups tore into the western provinces in the early 5th century and wrecked the tax base of Gaul, Spain, and North Africa, they did not just take land. They took the money that paid the soldiers who were supposed to take the land back. Less territory meant less tax, which meant fewer troops, which meant less territory still. A machine with no slack in it, no reserve of trust or treasure to fall back on, because both had been spent generations earlier in the mint. There is a piece of evidence for this hiding in plain sight, and it is the fact the barbarian story alone struggles to explain. The empire had 2 halves, east and west, and they faced many of the same barbarians and the same pressures. Yet the west fell in the 5th century, and the east, ruled from Constantinople, survived for another 1,000 years. The clearest difference between them was not courage or virtue, it was money. The wealthy, densely populated, heavily monetized eastern provinces kept generating the tax revenue that paid for walls and soldiers and bribes. The West, its richest provinces stripped away one by one, ran out of the thing that buys survival. Same enemies, different balance sheets, different endings. The barbarians, in the end, did not have to break down the door. Rome had spent 200 years quietly removing the hinges. In the year 476, a barbarian commander named Odoacer deposed the last emperor in the West, a boy called Romulus Augustulus, and did not bother to replace him. That date is the one the textbooks circle, but by then the ending was old news. The real work had been done centuries before, in tax offices and mints, 1% of silver at a time. Now I want to be careful here, because this is a subject where it is easy to sound more certain than the evidence allows, and easy to turn history into a sermon. This is not a story where money is the single villain and everything else is decoration. Historians genuinely disagree about why Rome fell, and they disagree in good faith. Peter Heather argues that the decisive factor was external, that Rome was doing well enough until the Huns kicked over the anthill of barbarian Europe and sent whole peoples crashing into the empire. Adrian Goldsworthy points above all to the endless civil wars, Romans killing Romans while the borders burned. Edward Gibbon, centuries ago, blamed a loss of civic virtue and the rise of Christianity, and versions of that moral story are still with us, and a whole school of scholars, associated with historians like Peter Brown and Walter Goffart, argues that the word fall is wrong altogether. In their telling, this was less a collapse than a long transformation, in which barbarian groups settled inside the empire, adopted Roman ways, and blended with the population to grow the medieval world out of the Roman one. On this view, the emperor in the West simply faded out, and for a great many ordinary people the sky never fell at all. Ward-Perkins wrote his book largely to argue the opposite, pointing to archaeology that shows real material collapse, pottery and tile and trade networks vanishing, living standards crashing. That argument is not settled, and I am not going to pretend to settle it for you in a video. The money story I have told you sits alongside all of those, not on top of them. But it is the thread that popular memory drops, and it is the one that historians like A.H.M. Jones, who wrote about inflation and taxation under the empire back in the 1950s, and Ward-Perkins in our own time, put close to the center. Debasement did not swing a sword. It just made sure that when the sword finally came, there was very little left standing behind the shield. And there is a second thing I do not want you to take away, which is the tidy little sermon that says, "Worthless money always destroys civilizations, so beware." Rome's coin was a lump of metal. The mechanics were specific to an ancient economy with mines and legions and no central bank, and you cannot draw a straight line from a 3rd century mint to a modern one and call it a law of nature. History rhymes. It does not repeat on command. What does carry across the centuries is smaller and quieter than a law, and more unsettling. Money is a promise a society makes to itself. It is the promise that the token in your hand tonight will still buy tomorrow what it buys today, and that promise is what lets millions of strangers trust each other enough to trade, to save, to plan, to belong to one thing. Rome broke that promise slowly, and for a good reason every single time. There was always a war to fund, an army to pay, a crisis this quarter that made a little debasement seem harmless. And by the time the empire understood what it had done and tried to make the promise good again, the trust was gone, and all that was left to hold the pieces together was force. That is the final quiet irony of it. Everything Rome did to save itself worked. The price edict, the taxes paid in grain, the farmers chained to their fields, the perfect gold coin, each one held. And each one made the empire a little less worth saving for the people living inside it, until the thing being defended and the reason to defend it had drifted so far apart that a lot of Romans could not remember which side they were supposed to be on. Rome did not die of a single wound. It died of a slow subtraction. 1% of silver at a time for 200 years, until the shell that was left looked solid right up to the afternoon somebody leaned on it, and it caved. If you made it to the end of this one, I want to know what you think. Look at the world right now and tell me, which country's money looks most like a late Roman coin to you? Leave it in the comments and try to be specific. And if this gave you a version of the fall of Rome your history teacher never did, subscribe, because this channel is about exactly this: the money underneath the history, the ledger behind the empire. I will see you in the next one.